New Hampshire is famous for its peaceful mountains and its fall foliage drives, but some towns here have gone dark as if they never existed. This is top 10 creepiest and most remote towns in New Hampshire, and every name on this list is a forgotten piece of New England. The deeper you go, the fewer traces of people you find. The truly chilling part isn't ghost stories, but the feeling of a community pulled out of real life, leaving behind forests, old roads, and a silence that feels unsettlingly real. Number 10. Monson Center. Monson Center sits right on the Milford and Hollis line with the simplest way in and a small parking area off Federal Hill Road in what locals recognize as the Monson Village area. On paper, this is southern New Hampshire, not the far edge of a mountain wilderness. In real life, the moment you step onto the trail, the distance to modern life feels bigger than the map admits. You are not driving hours into nowhere. You are walking minutes into a different century, and that contrast is exactly what makes Monson quietly unsettling. The Forest Society maintains this place as a protected historic and archaeological landscape, so the atmosphere is not chaotic or abandoned in the sloppy sense. It is cared for, labeled, and interpreted. That might sound comforting, but the effect is the opposite. The stones, cellar holes, and old foundations feel like rooms that have been politely preserved. The forest has been allowed to do what it does best, which is to soften sharp edges and fold human stories into its own rhythm. The result is a living outdoor archive where silence becomes the loudest narrator. Monson itself was a short-lived colonial settlement in the 18th century, and its quick disappearance still leaves a big, oddly modern question hanging in the air. Why would a community simply fade out so fast? You do not need to turn this into a ghost story to get the chills. The mystery is already built into the timeline. Monson is like a colonial startup that raised its first round with faith and grit, then shut down overnight without a final update. The humor lands because the truth underneath is real. Lives were invested here, routines were built here, and then the record goes thin. For visitors, Monson is ideal for slow, respectful exploration and for filming visuals that feel authentic rather than staged. Early fall and late spring give you the best light and the best balance between green cover and visible remains. The key is to treat the ground like a fragile page in a rare book. Watch your step, avoid sensitive areas, and let the place speak in its own quiet language. And if Monson feels like a gentle historical shiver, the next town will show a colder kind of creepiness, where people did not simply drift away, but were pulled by decisions larger than their own. Number 9. East Weare Village. East Weare Village belongs to the town of Weare and is tied to Everett Lake and the broader Everett Flood Control Project. A historical marker for the old village is recorded near New Hampshire Route 77, which sounds ordinary until you realize what that marker is really doing. It is not just pointing at a place, it is pointing at an absence. You can drive past the area thinking you are heading toward quiet water and pretty woods, and that is technically true. But the quiet here does not feel natural. It feels designed, like silence with paperwork behind it. The isolation of East Weare is not the rugged, deep forest kind. It is the isolation of a community that was removed from the daily world to make room for a public solution. The lake and the tree line create a cold, sealed atmosphere, as if the landscape is keeping a secret that is not supernatural, but bureaucratic and heartbreakingly human. This was once a village with families, routines, and small domestic rhythms that never make it into big history books. Then the logic of flood control arrived, and the map of ordinary life was redrawn. The creepy part is not a ghost in the woods. The creepy part is that the woods and the water look so calm that you could almost forget the price that bought that calm. You do not need to frame this as a tragedy with fireworks. The story works best as a slow moral question. What does it mean when a place disappears, not because of war, not because of disease, but because of engineering math? East Weare becomes a lesson in how a town can be archived rather than destroyed. The file is not deleted, it is just moved to a folder no one opens anymore. That idea lands hard for an audience that has watched factories close, main streets thin out, and entire ways of life get labeled as outdated. For visitors and filmmakers, the marker is a natural anchor point. The edge of the lake at late afternoon is even better, when the light softens and the water turns into a mirror that feels almost too peaceful. The visuals can be powerful without exaggeration. The practical warning is simple. Respect the site, stay mindful near the water, and treat the trails and weather with caution, because the beauty here can distract from the basics of safety. If Weare chills you with its gentle vanishing, the next place deepens the unease in a different way. It is the kind of story where people knew what was coming and still had to watch their village step into a future that had already been written. Number 8. Old Hill Village. Old Hill Village is tied to the Franklin Falls Dam on the Pemigewasset River, and today you can reach the area through recreation access around the dam and follow the Old Hill Village Trail. The geography is not far off the grid in a dramatic wilderness sense. It is close enough to feel normal, which is exactly why it can feel uncanny. You are not arriving at a forbidden zone. You are stepping into a version of everyday life that was carefully moved out of the way, like furniture pushed into the next room so a renovation could begin. This is isolation by planning, not by distance. The old village was relocated to make room for the flood control reservoir, and the modern community shifted to what became the New Hill Village. That fact alone is not spooky. The atmosphere comes from how civilized the disappearance was. There was no sudden collapse that left chaos in the streets. Instead, people had time to understand what was coming and to rebuild a functional future with a school, a town hall, and homes on higher ground. It is almost the polite version of losing your hometown, and that politeness is what gives the story its soft, unsettling edge. Old Hill is one of the rare relocations that happened with a plan so orderly it could pass a safety inspection. But that order does not erase the emotional cost. It just hides it behind neat timelines and sensible decisions. The creepiness here is a quiet sadness, the kind that makes you think about how many American towns have been reshaped by forces that were logical on paper and heavy in real life. And if Old Hill leaves you with that slow, thoughtful chill, the next town will shift the mood again. Not everyone was moved by a dam. Some places died for a colder reason, something simpler, more practical, and more ruthless than any legend. They ran out of what kept them alive. Number 7. Beebe River. Beebe River sits in the quiet spine of central New Hampshire, tucked into the Beebe River Valley in the Campton area. The river runs down from the Sandwich region and meets the Pemigewasset not far from Interstate 93, which makes this place feel deceptively reachable. You are not trekking to the end of the earth. You are taking a short detour from a modern highway into a corridor where the 20th century briefly lit up and then went dark. That convenience is part of the creep. The closer a ghost settlement is to your everyday route, the more unsettling it feels when you realize how completely a working community can vanish. The old mills and the company village once hugged this valley like a toolkit laid out for fast, efficient extraction. Today, the toolkit is gone. The forest is back in charge. The slopes and the dense tree cover make the remaining industrial traces look as if nature has reclaimed the deed and quietly changed the locks. It feels like walking along the backbone of an economy that died without a funeral, leaving only faint impressions of what it used to carry. This is one of those places where the truth does most of the scary work. There is no real town left here in the living sense. No morning traffic, no porch lights, no small talk at a local store. The realism comes from the total absence of ordinary life. That emptiness invites your imagination to fill in the missing noise, the saws, the whistles, the tired jokes of workers who expected the valley to keep paying their bills. The story of Beebe River is intertwined with early 20th century logging railroads and a boom model that was always temporary, even if nobody wanted to say it out loud. This was a pop-up, industrial city built to work hard, move fast, and leave once the green gold thinned out. The darkly funny comparison almost writes itself. Beebe River is like a dinner party where the host cuts the music early because the budget is gone, and the guests have to understand mid-bite that the night is over. But that joke lands because it describes a real American pattern. When the resource dries up, the calendar of human life shuts down with it. Beebe River still carries a nostalgic industrial chill, but the next place turns the mood darker because it suggests something even more ruthless. A community that existed almost entirely to serve one machine and disappeared when that machine no longer needed it. Number 6. Little Canada. Little Canada was a small working settlement tied to the J.E. Henry logging system in the Lincoln area, a footnote hiding in the shadow of a much louder industrial story. If you drive through modern Lincoln today with its familiar tourist pulse and everyday convenience, it is hard to imagine how close you are to a place that once existed almost entirely to serve a single purpose. That is where the creepiness starts, not in distance, but in contrast. Little Canada is the kind of past that sits near the present and still feels invisible, like a room in your own house that everyone stopped opening until the air changed. This settlement did not vanish with a dramatic bang. It faded the way a company-built life can fade when the business model shifts and the schedules move on without sentiment. The remains are sparse and quiet, foundations, concrete pieces, stone traces, the sort of industrial leftovers that do not look like ruins at first glance. Then your brain catches up and you realize these were not props. They were the scaffolding of real routines, real fatigue, real paychecks, and the fragile hope that the work would last. Little Canada worked as a helper community for the larger logging machine. When that machine turned elsewhere, the settlement lost its reason to breathe. The most fitting image is not a haunted village, but a seasonal train station that opened for one brief rush and then got removed from the timetable forever. The train never came back, and the station did not get a second life. The one-time usefulness is the unsettling part. It whispers a harsh truth about boomtowns across America. Sometimes a place is built not to grow old gracefully, but to burn bright, serve the job, and disappear. For filmmakers and curious visitors, Little Canada offers texture rather than spectacle. Close shots of moss clinging to concrete, the muted geometry of foundations against the forest floor, and the uncomfortable calm of a site that has been returned to the trees can all carry the story without forcing a ghost into it. This is not a spot to treat casually. Go with someone else, plan your route, and have navigation that does not depend on cell service. The place is close to modern life, but the moment you step into its footprint, you are dealing with a landscape that no longer follows modern rules. And if Little Canada feels like a small community that died quietly under a company logic, the next town delivers a sharper jolt. There, a single event is enough to make an entire place go dark. Number 5. Johnson was a sawmill village that once belonged to Lincoln, sitting a short distance north of the larger J.E. Henry mill complex. That geographic detail matters because it frames the atmosphere. Johnson was not the star of the show. It was the side stage of a timber empire built close enough to the main machinery to feel useful and alive, but distant enough to be easy to forget once the lights went out. The woods that now wrap the area do not feel like a scenic backdrop. They feel like the closing credits. What makes Johnson quietly creepy is how thin its footprint is. You are not looking at a grand ghost town with a dramatic skyline of ruins. You are looking at hints, traces, the subtle remains of a place that existed for work rather than identity. The forest and the fading industrial marks give it a strange supporting character vibe, like a town that never got to finish its own sentence. There is no independent community here now, no local rhythm that survived, just the uneasy reminder that some settlements were designed to be temporary, even if the people living there hoped otherwise. The story turns dark not through legend, but through fragility. Johnson had a short life, then it slipped into abandonment after a major mill fire in the early 20th century. The most honest way to capture it is with a simple metaphor. This town was an orchestra with one instrument. When that instrument burned, the concert ended. The point is not to scare anyone with ghosts. The point is to let the audience feel how fast a place can lose its pulse when it relies on a single beating heart. You can almost imagine the day after the fire when the practical questions arrived before the grief had time to settle. Where do we work now? Where do we go now? How long before the map forgets us? And if Johnson feels like the opening note of a rail and timber era vanishing act, the next place will widen the frame. Bigger scale, more people, and a collapse so fast it almost sounds impossible until you see the silence it left behind. Number 4. Carrigain sat west of Livermore in the White Mountains, born along the path of the old Saco Valley Railroad that followed the Dry River and Mount Washington River Valley. The geography matters because this was never a town that grew naturally around a church green or a family farm. It was a town engineered by movement. Rails came first, people came second, and the forest watched the whole arrangement with the patience of something that knows it will outlast everyone. The isolation here is a railroad kind of isolation. The tracks created a pulse, then the pulse disappeared. The steep river valley and dense woods do the rest. Even if you are not far from famous mountain scenery, the atmosphere feels like you have slipped into a back hallway of history. You stand in a place that once felt busy enough to justify its own name, and now the loudest sounds are water and trees. That contrast is the creepiness. Not a jump scare, but the uneasy realization that a society can be built on a schedule and erased on a schedule just as fast. Carrigain had serious scale for a logging town, the kind of place that briefly felt like a sure bet. Then the timber thinned, the reason for the railroad weakened, and the town lost its job and its future at the same time. Carrigain was like a movie theater that only ever showed one film. When the tickets stopped selling, the theater did not pivot to a new genre. It became a ruin. The unsettling part is the speed. A community that looked like it was rising could fall so quickly that the story almost sounds exaggerated until you remember how boom economies work. For a visitor today, Carrigain is not about comfort. It is about texture, silence, and the shape of what is missing. The remains are subtle, foundations, old paths, quiet angles in the forest that hint at human order. It is the kind of place where you should carry good shoes, water, and a realistic expectation that convenience is not part of the deal. That lack of modern support is precisely what gives the site its power on camera. You can film a ridgeline, a mossy stone, a faint trace of a route that once mattered, and let the audience feel the weight of a town that was created by industry and abandoned by the same hand. Carrigain shows how business can invent a town and then walk away without looking back. And the next place deepens the chill even further, because sometimes the most ruthless editor of history is not a company or a railroad, but fire. Number 3. Zeeland. Zeeland was a company logging town in the township of Carroll, and the easiest modern clue to its existence is the state historical marker at the intersection of U.S. Route 302 and Zeeland Road along the Crawford Notch corridor. On a bright day, this stretch of Route 302 feels like classic New Hampshire postcard country. You get the mountains, the clean air, the drive that makes you believe the world is still simple. Then you turn toward Zeeland and the mood shifts. It is like walking out of a well-lit theater into a side hallway where the lights are lower and the echoes are older. That contrast is the first layer of creepiness. Zeeland feels isolated not because it is impossibly far, but because it sits so close to a scenic tourist artery while belonging to a different emotional climate. You can be surrounded by beauty and still sense that history here was sharp, fast, and unforgiving. The valley and the dense forest hold the memory of industry the way ash holds the shape of a burned page. The remains matter less than the atmosphere of a place that once had a job to do and then lost the reason to exist. Zeeland was built up in the late 19th century as part of a larger logging system. It was a practical town with a practical heartbeat. When the timber economy changed and massive forest fires swept through this region, the story bent hard. You do not need to sell this as a haunted site. The real tension comes from the idea that nature and industry both played editor, cutting chapters out of the local narrative. A useful image is that Zeeland is like a book with singed edges, still readable in places but missing enough pages to make you anxious about what you will never recover. Zeeland is still a story of the forest winning in the end, but the next place brings a colder flavor of creepiness. a more tightly organized timber world, and a deeper sense of isolation that can make both drivers and viewers swallow hard before the story even gets to the details. Number 2. Gosport is tied to the Isles of Shoals, sitting offshore from the Portsmouth area where the coastline looks calm enough to lull you into thinking the ocean is just scenery. Star Island is the familiar seasonal gateway with ferry services that typically depart from Portsmouth or Rye Harbor depending on the operator. The setup sounds friendly and historic, almost like a maritime field trip. But the moment you realize how thin the year-round footprint is out here, the mood changes. This is not a haunted theme park. It is an island community shaped by weather, distance, and the kind of silence that only shows up once the last boat leaves. The isolation is ocean isolation, which hits differently than forest isolation. Fog rolls in like it has a schedule. Wind edits the soundtrack. During the day, you can frame Gosport as history and coastal tourism, the kind of place where old stories feel charming and manageable. Then late afternoon arrives and the light shifts, and suddenly the same docks and paths feel like they are remembering something colder. That is when the story turns dark, not because you saw anything supernatural, but because you finally feel how small a human life looks when the sea decides the rules. The Isles of Shoals carry layers of maritime history and the psychology of living with long gaps between comfort and risk. You can lean into that without overplaying it. The creepiest truth is that island life trains you to respect distance as a living force. If you want a dark little metaphor to keep the tone sharp, living near Gosport is like sitting beside an old radio that still catches the past, but the signal always crackles right when you want the clearest answer. The mystery is not a monster. The mystery is how many stories the ocean keeps half-finished. For viewers who would actually consider visiting, the practical notes make the creep feel real. This is a seasonal trip. Check ferry schedules early, expect weather to change quickly, and bring an extra layer even in summer because the sea loves surprises. The best filming is honest filming. Mist on the water, a quiet walkway, a flag snapping in the wind, and the feeling that you are a guest in a place that never promised to be welcoming. And if an island already makes you feel tiny, the next entry turns that feeling into a deeper unease. It pulls the story back to the mainland, where dense forest does not just hide the road, it hides the remains of a town that once lived, worked, and then disappeared like a whisper you are not sure you actually heard. Number 1. Livermore is a ghost township tucked into the White Mountains, with most of its footprint folded into the White Mountain National Forest. The old village site sits roughly 16 miles west of North Conway and about a mile and a half off U.S. Route 302 via Sawyer River Road. On a map, that sounds simple. In real life, it feels like you are slipping off the edge of the modern world without ever leaving the state. You are not chasing a myth deep into nowhere. You are taking a realistic drive into a place that quietly refuses to feel contemporary. This is isolation in the technical sense. Cell signal grows weak, the forest thickens, the valley stretches long and narrow. The road and the landscape begin to behave like a filter that screens out noise, convenience, and certainty. It is easy to feel that nature has signed the paperwork to reclaim the whole town. The moment you stop hearing the small comforts of ordinary life, the atmosphere turns. And this is where everything starts to fall apart. Not in your eyes, but in your expectations. Livermore was once a logging hub with rail lines and worker life pulsing through the woods. When the timber era pulled back, the town did not age gracefully. It went dark. The most accurate image is not a haunted village screaming for attention, but a stage that still has the backdrop in place while the cast walked away a century ago. The unsettling part is that you can still sense where people used to stand, where routines used to begin, where a community expected tomorrow to look like today. There are small stories tied to places like this that locals do not exactly deny. They just do not want to be the first person to say them out loud. For filming, Livermore is the perfect climax because the creepiness is earned rather than performed. Foundations, quiet clearings, and traces of human order sit inside a forest that has become the final narrator. The best visit windows are when the forest roads are stable and the light is long enough to let the story breathe. Bring offline navigation, extra power, and a small group rather than a solo hero fantasy. This site works best when it is treated like a protected memory. Respect the National Forest rules, avoid disturbing foundations and old burial areas, and let the silence do what it does best. New Hampshire is not just fall colors and calm, postcard roads. It also holds towns that became shadows of themselves, shaped into silence by forest, fire, industry, or planning. What makes these places truly unsettling is not a cheap ghost story. It is the way ordinary lives can be erased so cleanly that only foundations, markers, and rumor remain. Some viewers will swear the creepiest part is the local legends. Others will feel the colder truth is how history can delete a community without drama, without noise, and without a second chance. So which location in this countdown hit you the hardest? The quiet colonial mystery, the engineered disappearance, the one-purpose mill towns, the ocean isolation, or the forest that swallowed everything? Drop your pick in the comments and tell us why. And if you want to follow up exploring more forbidden zones across New England, you know what to do.